Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Sigelman. I'm CEO of Burning Glass, and it's such a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. Thanks for making time over lunch, and excited for this conversation today. Over the last, we've recently been taking a close look at the question of new degree programs over the last several months of the pandemic in particular, have placed significant new strains on higher education, and a lot of new impetus to be looking at new programs as sources of growth as enrollments in traditional programs are declining. And yet, what we find, of course, is that it's never as simple as it sounds. And unfortunately, the track record of institutions in achieving success in the new program launches has been checkered at best. More on that in a minute, but first, I wanted just to offer first a quick note, which is that we'd love to take your questions and make this an interactive session. So hope that you will just put your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll try to take them as we go along. Second, this recording of this will be available afterwards, and of course, finally, if you haven't already had a chance to read the report, encourage you to visit the research page in the Burning Glass website, and you can download the report there. I am absolutely delighted for the chance to have this conversation today with Michael Horn. Michael is a senior strategist at Guild Education. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute, and is in general a gentleman who needs no further introduction. Michael, it's great to be together.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Matt, and to be able to talk about this report and dissect it is incredibly exciting, because I think it's the case that rarely does a report come across your transom in higher ed where the findings are so clear and so unmistakably important. And this one delivered on that in my mind. And I read it literally 3 times, because each time I went through it, I was coming up with new insights from it that I think are incredibly important. For folks listening, I think this is an incredibly important conversation about higher education institutions and the decision-making process around launching new programs to drive revenue, in particular right now, because we know that colleges are having a lot of financial strains across their business model. The Hechinger Report, which is a great organization that reports on education at all levels out of Columbia University, they estimate that more than 500 institutions currently show 2 or more signs of financial strain. We know that undergraduate enrollments have fallen just 4% in the last year alone, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic coming in. In particular, first-year enrollments have dropped 16%. And this is part of a longer-term trend, right, of declining enrollments, with, frankly, the biggest cliff yet to come among traditional age students starting after 2025 because of demographic trends. And we've seen the impact of that in higher ed. More than 50 institutions have closed or merged since 2016, according to Education Dive. 40 merged between 2010 to 17. So that rate is just going up quite dramatically right now. And we know that there are big proposals on the table in states like Pennsylvania and Connecticut to do a number of mergers work. And then I think against that troubled backdrop, there's this sense, Matt, that yes, the business model is broken, but we'll just grow our way out. We'll launch new programs and drive new revenues. And if you build it, they will come sort of mindset a lot of times. But, that may not be happening. And as you all acknowledge in the report, and I'll quote here before I jump into a question that I'm dying to ask you, which is, not every program will produce large numbers of graduates in the same way that not all products succeed in the marketplace, or not all markets become summer blockbusters. But the stakes are particularly high right now for U.S. higher education, given this financial challenges, these financial, maelstrom almost that they're facing in many cases. And so the price of getting it wrong is quite significant. And so that's where I would love to start the conversation, which is when you think about, when you say these new programs that they're launching, to seek and serve new students are failing in so many cases. What do you mean by failing when you talk about it, and how did you determine the threshold for a new program that was failing?
So when we talk about failure, we're actually talking about some pretty concrete, pretty abject measures, frankly. And what we really looked at here was to take a look at programs that started in 2012, 2013. So we essentially wound the clock backwards 5 years from the most recent data set of conferrals. We said of programs that first started conferring degrees in those years, how many conferrals were they conferring in the 2018-19 academic year? And what we found was that, again, we're talking about not kind of sort of failure, but abject failure in a lot of cases here, where 30% of programs that had started out in 2012 or 2013 were conferring no degrees at all by 2018. And about 2/3 of programs that started 5 years later were conferring fewer than 10 degrees. Now, this is not a judgment about the value of programs. This is a question of whether programs can meet a basic financial viability metric. And if you're setting up a program and you are and you're graduating, and just think about all the expense that's associated with that. And by our reckoning, that's probably something in the neighborhood of about $350,000, $500,000 per year. And we get into a little bit of that in the report. We should think about cost of adding faculty member, classroom space, of curriculum design, all that sort of stuff. This is a conservative estimate. So over the course of that 5-year period, you spent something in the neighborhood of $2+ million. If you're minting only 10 degrees a year, it's really hard to see that as being anything but a failure. A lot of, especially because I think you put this so well, Michael, a minute ago, that a lot of what institutions are doing when they're starting programs is they're saying, okay, how do we find a new ticket toward financial viability? How do we solve our revenue problem by just growing beyond it? Great, but if the goal for financially strapped institutions and the statistics you just cited from Accenture are so sobering, if in the face of fiscal crisis, the answer is we're going to start new programs, and those new programs not only don't deliver, but they actually wind up draining money out of the coffers, you've not fixed the problem, you've made the problem worse.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Matt. And in some ways, you all get into this in the report, but the complexity of driving additional programs in terms of how it increases overhead costs. And you all make the point in the report that, these cost roughly $350 to $500K per year to run, but that doesn't actually count all the overhead costs that incurs. And as a general rule of thumb, what I'll tell folks listening is anytime an institution increases in scale it doubles in scale, overhead costs tend to drop by about 15%. But when you increase the number of pathways or programs you offer, overhead costs actually increase 30%. And so that not counting of overhead costs and just launching programs that don't pay off, I think has actually maybe even more fiscal downside than institutions recognize. Now, to balance that, you all point out something important in the report, which I was struck by, which is that not all program launches are intended to confer large numbers of degrees or graduates. And I'm sure some people will immediately think, well, hey, liberal arts programs, for example, they must be at the highest risk of failure because, people aren't, clamoring for those programs right now. But maybe that's okay because that's not what they're designed to do. And like having all these questions. But what was so striking was that's not at all what you found in the research, was it?
No, it's sort of interesting. So first of all, I think there's a couple of things I want to pull apart there. So I think you're right, and I think it's very important to bear in mind that there are a lot of reasons to start new programs, and sometimes new programs, new research centers are started not as a revenue solution, but because they're advancing the mission of the university. And I think that's fine as long as institutions are explicit about that. But I think the point of having a set of concrete, incontrovertible metrics to look at is to make sure that when you are making that kind of decision, when you're launching that kind of program, which is really more about the mission of the university, which is really more about helping students contribute in outside of the university as they complete their degrees, it is important that you're realizing that you're making an investment, a financial investment in a social or academic mission, and that you're not just writing yourself a path, that you're having that as an explicit bound. Now, to the second part of things, the second point I'd want to bring up here in answer to your question is, and this was really interesting, that we really didn't see the kind of divide that one might expect, that practical programs do well and liberal arts programs turn out to really struggle. In fact, what we saw, you can see here, is that fairly comparable rates of success across, for example, religious studies and or area, ethnic, cultural, gender studies programs, performing in similar ways to what you're seeing in various kinds of practical programs, in science, technician type programs and engineering programs, all more or less within the same range. So what this tells me is it's really not so much about what the program is covering, what its area is. It's really a lot more about the institution and how sharp it is about defining defining the program, defining the market, and making sure that it's really going to be a successful proposition.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I guess the follow-on was you didn't just see this in terms of the split between vocational versus liberal arts programs, right? That wasn't predictive, but it actually went against something I would have predicted, which is, well, Matt, everyone knows undergrads are declining, but graduates are, graduate students are not. That's where the increase is. Even in the pandemic, that's true, and that's not really actually what you found in the research either.
No, in fact, likewise, very comparable rates of program failure across the full spectrum. Of course, whether you're talking about master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, just a few points difference across them. Overall, master's degrees were slightly less likely to fail than bachelor's degrees or associate's degrees, but slightly, right? We're talking about 62% versus 70%. For master's degrees degree program starts, which are really most clearly designed, and you look at sort of the majority of program starts and master's degrees are designed to be part of a professional ed, continuing ed spectrum, where the objectives are pretty unequivocal, and yet you're seeing 2/3 of programs fail. That was really surprising.
Yeah, I was really struck by it because I thought, well, undergraduate, there's all these other reasons you might launch programs. I'm not super surprised, right, at some of the failures, but grad school, surely there are much more market analysis going into it. We know that there's more growth and demand for particularly online programs and the like, but you just didn't see that. But what was interesting was that there was a characteristic that seemed to predict a stronger track record at starting new programs. So I'd love you to dig into what those programs were or those schools were rather, their characteristics that did better off, and what you think is behind their secret, because it's not immediately obvious from the outside, I think.
So first of all, by the way, one quick thought in terms of the bachelor's degree point you make is a really important one too, because another way, you pointed out how at a cost level, we're really undercounting and understating the problem as a result. And I'd say there's another dimension of that too, because when you think about new bachelor's degree programs, for the most part, actually, schools are not necessarily growing the enrollment base, even if the new bachelor's program, captures, is proving to 10 degrees a year, or even if they're exceeding these thresholds. In a lot of cases, what you're really doing is you're just shuffling things around. And so if you start a program and even if it meets this threshold of success of, let's say, 10 conferrals, and it's producing, let's say, 20 conferrals, if those aren't net positive additions to the enrollment of the school, then actually you've taken additional costs, you haven't necessarily brought in additional revenue. I know that sounds like a really obvious point, but it deserves to be said, because usually we tend to look at programs in isolation from one another, as opposed to looking at the broader whole. In master's degree programs, at least the admission is pretty channeled. You're admitted into a specific degree program. In bachelor's, in a lot of institutions, you're admitted to the overall undergraduate program. And if one major has more, one major has less, it's all the same pie, if you haven't grown the pie. But your question, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say before you actually leave that point, just because I think it is so important, is the reason that overhead costs matter so much in higher ed is that's actually where the most significant cost increases have come over the last generation, right? It's not faculty salaries growing at rates disproportionate to inflation or something like that. It's not the lazy rivers and climbing walls and extravagances, and certainly debt service and buildings are part of the story. But the biggest cost increase is actually the growth of administrative overhead costs in institutions. And some of that is trying to better serve a more diverse student population, for sure. But a lot of that is just program creep, which, as you said, doesn't produce this revenue increase, but it does contribute to a lot more costs. And I think institutions need to have a more holistic view of that, of not trying to be all things to all people, but saying, hey, actually our mission is squarely focused on X, and therefore we're going to be super excellent in this limited set, and not try to, do the Harvard model, if you will, of higher ed, where you can find anything here, because it feeds on itself in creating this unsustainable problem. And I actually think it weaves into where you were about to go, Matt, to answer my question around what institutions actually, ironically, are doing this better in the higher ed sector.
Well, and to your point, exactly, what we find is that actually who's doing this better tends to be institutions that are a bit larger and therefore have more scale and therefore more scope for experimentation. If you're a relatively small institution, then you have to be focused. And so I think your point is so spot on, because if you're if you don't have that same scope, trying to set up programs in all different directions is a recipe for disaster. You have to be a lot more focused. And I think that explains why when you look at smaller institutions, the failure rate is just so high. The market factors are that much harder to overcome. The scale that's needed for success is that much harder to develop. But the focus, I think, is probably the key to why there is so much failure as you get smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and it was striking to me, Matt, because I think it's part of this broader narrative in higher ed that we're seeing play out, which is that those institutions, let's put it this way, the rich get richer in some sense, right? Those institutions with the most seem to continue to do better at the various games and machinations that have been created in the various admissions games and enrollment games and introducing new programs and the like. And so, and obviously those institutions with large endowments also can play this game quite well. And then the third data point I would introduce into that is that over the previous, I want to say 10 years or something like that, schools that had fewer than 1,000 students shrunk by 5%, whereas those that had more than 10,000 students on average actually grew at a time where higher ed was decreasing writ large. And so this big get bigger, rich get richer sort of narrative that has played out, I think has been quite significant. And you see some really large scale institutions just consistently being better, if you will, at launching new programs, probably because they're able to invest more deeply, I would imagine, in the planning upfront, the market analyses, understanding their true competitive position, understanding market demand from employers, understanding how that's going to translate into student demand, and the like. I suspect you have examples that you've seen in your own work around institutions that just seem to do this more, better, if you will, consistently.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things I would keep in mind. First of all, I think you're right. And the data are very clear on this. There's certain sets of institutions that have developed some really good athleticism about in terms of their ability to launch large numbers of new programs and have good rates of success. In other words, institutions that aren't just launching one or two a year, but maybe you're launching 10 or so new programs a year. So these are institutions that are at scale, and where they're pretty good at it. These are institutions like Boston University, like ASU. There are for-profits like Capella. There are schools like NYU, GWU, Broward College, George Mason, that have a very good success record. And more in a minute about, I think, what they get right. But I think, I think first and foremost, though, I'd say that they are very disciplined about really thinking about their new programs as products that need to serve an audience, that need to serve a market, that need to fit into that market. So they're very analytical about understanding what's the market for those, both in terms of competitive position, in terms of the career need that their programs serve, and as a result are much more successful. Now, one thing I will point out, though, which I think is worth double clicking on, I would say no schools are, and particularly the schools that actually are doing it as a volume. You can probably be successful if you're launching one or two programs a year, and there are definitely some institutions that we saw able to do that and consistently able to do it and do so successfully. If you're depending on a program-based strategy, you are going to make some mistakes, and I mentioned, for example, some of the bunch of institutions that we think do this well, where the data support the fact that they seem to do this well at scale. They still are, probably about, depending on the institution, 20 to 30% of their new programs don't actually achieve the critical mass of these 10 conferrals. And so I think a key lesson here is, as with any kind of innovation, you have to expect some level of failure. And part of what's so important about having good metrics of success is being able to step back successfully and evaluate and to make tough calls. If you haven't set good metrics, then you wind up tolerating failure for too long. Not tolerating failure may mean taking aggressive action to make programs successful. It may mean taking aggressive action to cut programs that you just think are not going to make it. But it's important. Part of being successful is not only what you get right, but how you react when you get things wrong.
It's a really important point, Matt, because I think all too often when I'm talking to presidents at universities or other faculty members and so forth, sometimes they rightly resist, I think, just a drive to say, hey, is the program create a certain margin for the institution or number of students or something very narrow like that. From my perspective, it's have very clear, be very clear about why are we launching it, and then drive the metrics from that answer to the why. And so in some cases, it is revenue. It does have to cover it. It is growth. And if it doesn't cross a threshold of covering costs and overhead, I would argue it's not worth it. And sometimes it's going to be for the research purpose of the institution or to fill out an undergrad experience, but not to offer a graduate, right, in demand for something else or something like that. And then you ought to have metrics around that: number of course takers, research dollars brought into the institution, whatever it is, but be super clear about it. And the reason for clarity around it is in higher ed, like all walks of life, the moment you put something out there and it performs, if there's not clarity around what is success, it just invites a lot of backbiting, a lot of questions. It hinders other efforts at innovating and improving and so forth. Whereas if you're clear, you don't have to take it personally that a program fails, right? You can say, hey, this is success because we recognized it wasn't doing what we wanted it to do. Before we invested 10 years or 15 years of marketing might and dollars and time behind this, we could see it wasn't paying off. We're going to make the decision as an institution because we all agreed on these 2 or 3 parameters up front, right? And having that clarity, I think, is incredibly important. The second thing, again, you talked about when you're innovating, having the mindset that some are going to fail. It's why I think having a portfolio model as you do this is so important, where you build a failure rate into your assumptions, and then that actually is going to cover this, like the successes have to cover that failure rate, if you will. And the third thought I have on it is when I was reading the report, and it weaves into a question that's from the audience that I'm about to ask, but I also thought about athletics and how a lot of colleges say, well, we'll start a new sports team, or we'll move to D1 football, or whatever it is, or we'll build a new stadium in the effort to, raise our national profile, raise the student composition, get into the top 50, boost our, alumni giving, whatever it might be, and transform the complexion of the institution. And sometimes that's a terrific strategy. I think it's, worked at places like UNLV and the like. But a lot of times it hasn't worked, and it creates a huge amount of cost without the boost, if you will, to mission and these other intangibles, and becomes a real drag on the institution. And I think it's having that sober-minded. And so the question that then has come in from an audience member, they say, well, is there an implication that should smaller colleges be more aggressive, frankly, in looking to consolidate 10 or more colleges into one operating entity? I'll give a quick answer to that, Matt, but then I'd love your take on it. My take is, in some cases, maybe, because there are efficiency gains. When you do have more resources, you are able to take sometimes these more methodical looks. But I wouldn't say always, because I think some institutions, like you take like a place like Trinity, Washington, in Washington, D.C., their value is because they're small and they're super clear about who they are and what they do and what they won't do. And that's the experience that they craft and curate, and students want that when they come from them. And so to me, it comes more back to clarity. And do you have a distinct value proposition that rings out with the students you're trying to attract and makes sense from a business model perspective, rather than sort of crafting a blanket rule?
Yeah, I would just build on that. I think we were talking before about the importance of focus. And if you're going to consolidate a set of institutions, as you said, there can be operating efficiencies, though, by the way, getting 10 institutions that are geographically proximate enough that you can realize those efficiencies may or may not be realistic. But be that as it may, there's certainly operating efficiencies, but you're really only going to reap those benefits. You're only going to realize those efficiencies if you can be very disciplined about actually consolidating programs, not just consolidating operations. And to do that means, again, having a disciplined set of metrics about which programs are going to be winners and losers at which campuses, and how do you therefore make sure that you've got the right viability in the ones that you're going to keep, and where you're going to keep them. Part of that is not only about looking at the programs, but it's also about looking at the curriculum itself. one of the things that we've been doing, we've been spending a lot of time recently supporting our clients. We are tagging their courses to skills. And when you do that, one of the things you realize when you stack things up is you realize that a lot of institutions are teaching the same thing in a bunch of different, the same skill being learned in 8 different departments. Now multiply that by, if we're consolidating 10 institutions into one, so you may have 80 instantiations of the same course or of the same skill being taught within courses. How do you, an important part of this is not only consolidating the programs, but consolidating the courses. There's a lot of opportunity to achieve cost savings by being very hard-nosed about evaluating what you're teaching at a program level, what you're teaching at a course level. To get there, you've got to apply a good level of granularity, both in terms of what we know about the market of programs, the market for programs, and what we know about the granularity of what you're teaching within those programs.
Yeah, so Matt, and just an encouragement to the audience, keep submitting questions. I will start to pull them in more, but I have a few more I want to get to as well. In your mind, then the lessons that we pull out of those big institutions that do it well, other institutions that do it well, you just talked about some of the ability to look beneath the program level at the level of courses and curriculums and skills themselves. But broadly, how do you think about it from a framework perspective of how schools can de-risk new program launch decisions?
Yeah, I think about 6 core rubrics that I think institutions need to keep in mind. And I'm breaking the cardinal rule of consultants, which is you should only have 3 of anything. But
I'll forgive you.
I'm going to talk about first having the right programs, the right curriculum within those programs, the right format for the program, having the right market for the program, having the right partners, and then also having the right time. And so let me just say a few words about each of those. In terms of right programs, that may seem, particularly in the context of this conversation, to be the most obvious. But I think it's important to how institutions surface those programs, what processes they have in place to identify new program opportunities is worth spending a little bit of time on, because most institutions tend to be pretty haphazard about how new program ideas are floated up to the top, either bottom up from a professor who thinks, they've got a wonderful idea. Wouldn't it be cool if we start a program in whatever it is? Or one of the trustees says, well, I know this guy who I know from the Rotary Club, says he'd hire 30 students if they came out of there, and off you go to starting a new program. So getting the right programs means really making sure that we have a strong sense of purpose, a strong sense of processes for mining the opportunity landscape. And I think an important part of that is being demand driven. And that's a hard thing for institutions, because higher education institutions are really developed to purposefully be about putting students first. It's what we do in the world of higher education. It's what we should be doing unequivocally. But at the same time, if you're developing programs that are going to be successful, they have to resound with students' need to have a bridge to opportunity, which means you need to actually start your analysis understanding what are the big opportunity areas where there's a strong demand for talent. How do we help students develop themselves into those opportunity areas? So understanding the right program, getting the program right is about that. It's about asking the question and continuing asking the questions. I've seen some programs some schools have done some very impressive things. For example, Eastern Connecticut State University. They've gotten faculty much more attuned to this by making this part of how faculty have to propose new courses, propose new programs. It's literally right there on the proposal form of what are the data say about the market demand. Right curriculum is a little more subtle. It's not just about consolidating curriculum, as we were talking about them before, but it's about making sure that you're teaching the right sets of skills within a program. I remember once having a conversation a little while ago with a researcher at a big think tank, and she was saying, yeah, it doesn't seem to us. She'd been working with a large university, and she said, it looks like there's just not a lot of demand for I think it was industrial engineers around that university's market. And looking at the data, it was like, it was a huge amount of demand. So what gives you that impression? Well, graduates come out of that program and they can't get jobs. Well, that could be one of two things. Either, it could mean that there's no jobs, or since we know there are jobs, maybe it means that you're not teaching the right sets of skills. So if you're going to get a program right, you've got to construct the program with the sets of skills that are going to make sure that students succeed. Right format, again, in terms of, God's in the details. Is this an online program? Is it an on-ground program? Is it evenings and weekends? Is it, and if so, when? I remember some analysis that University of Maryland, Baltimore County did using our data. They were starting a GIS mapping program, and initially put it in their Silver Spring campus, just outside Washington, D.C., and wasn't the success they wanted. They were investigating to move it back to Baltimore, to the main campus, because it's closer to the U.S. Geological Survey. What they found was actually that there was a lot of demand. The demand was closer to Silver Spring than it was to Baltimore. It was kind of Northern Virginia and the like, and other D.C. suburbs. But they had set the program at 5 p.m. And just, for those of you who spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., trying to navigate the Beltway at 5 p.m., when you're just ending, you get out of work, let's say 4:30, and try to be at 5 o'clock in class, just wasn't going to happen. But literally, just by changing it to, I think, a Saturday, Sunday program, they went from a struggling program to a successful program. Right market really speaks to the competitive forces. You can have the exact right program, exactly right designed. It's in the format that's going to meet the needs of learners. But ultimately, if there are stronger peers who are launching the same program, if there are maybe they're not even stronger peers, but they're peers that have already been in that market and accrued a reputation locally, that's going to be a challenge. And so really understanding the competitive dynamics around a market is another key part of this. Right partners is about the importance of engaging with industry. Overall, it's something which higher education struggles to do systematically. We'll often have various employer councils, we'll do the donut breakfast, and the like. But actually going out proactively as you're developing a program and making sure that the shoe fits is something that doesn't happen enough as part of a new program launch process. Right time, I think, finally speaks to, timing is everything in everything in life, right? And so we're trying to develop programs that last. And so that means also thinking ahead to where demand is going to be, to where demand is today. And getting that right is another key part of what needs to go into de-risking new program decisions.
Yeah, so I'll say, Matt, that I think a lot of us are looking forward to the opportunity to reconvene and have those donut breakfasts. But a big takeaway that I have from what you just said is that, reading market demand actually is in fact student-centered, and these things are not opposed to each other. And so I think that's a huge message to come out of that. You brought up a third thing that I think is also worth teeing up on, and it's a question that I have. And I'll explain why in a moment, but you just mentioned new programs. They need to be built to last, but the market is increasingly dynamic, right? Jobs that were created 15 years ago, 10 years hence, right? From now will be will be passé and out of vogue and so forth. It costs a lot, though, not just in money, as you all point out in the report, not just in overhead costs, as we've talked a lot about here to develop a program, but also in the time to launch a program, building curriculum, getting accreditor approval, getting state authorization in some cases, sometimes federal authorization as well. And I think there's a big tension here sometimes because as my mentor, Clay Christensen, loved to say, the really unfortunate thing about data is it's by definition only backward looking, and it's only convincingly clear about things in the way distant past. And it doesn't always allow you to forecast forward. You need more context and information, or he would say a theory to do that. So how can schools look ahead if they start developing a program now, it might not launch for 3 years from now? How do they look ahead and not make a big bet that is going to miss because they didn't understand where the puck was going, so to speak?
Yeah. So two thoughts there. One is about, and we were talking a few minutes ago, we were using the word de-risking, and I think there's, when it comes to future-proofing program launches, I think there's an element of de-risking the inherent uncertainty about the future. And part of that is you just talked about the process of getting launched. And so as much as there's a question of how do you, execute on the Wayne Gretzky School of Program Development, and as you said, skate to where the puck is going. And so, yes, you need to have that intuitive sense that Gretzky had for where the puck was going on the ice, but it also is about how fast can you skate? I think there's a lot of institutions, as you called out a minute ago, take forever to get programs launched. And get it, there's a lot that you need to do. There's some of it is not dependent on the university at all. Those are things which are dependent on regulators, on accreditors, on a host of other factors. But the reality is that there are institutions who have gotten a lot more svelte about those processes, who've gotten a lot more efficient about those processes. Look at institutions like Cal Baptist, which dramatically reduced the time to a new program launch, from years to months, by just getting really efficient about, really templated about what are the analyses we can undertake, what are the steps you're going to do, and how do we make sure that happens, with total efficiency, and really impressive to see the institutions that have done that right. But there is an element here as well of, again, it's good to be a good skater, but you still want to be able to get ahead of the puck. I think a lot of that is, I think there's two ways of getting at that. One is to try to be able to, there's a kind of a near-term radar and a long-term radar. From a near-term radar perspective, I think, actually, notwithstanding the Clay's comments about the limitations of data, the data themselves are inherently present or backward, but the models that one can build around data can actually be quite predictably accurate looking forward. And we've developed a set of metrics, a set of models that can forecast demand a few years out with a very high level of accuracy. Now, as you said, when you're starting a new program, you want that to not just be for where demand's going to be a few years from now, but 10 years and more. And I think a lot of that is demands a journey of imagination. We'll be releasing a report next week, and I hope everyone listening will download the report, reach out to us. We're glad to send it along. Well, we're trying to map out what we think are going to be the jobs that drive recovery and beyond. And we focused in on 4 key secular trends that we think are going to be dominating the opportunity market well beyond the pandemic and throughout the 2020s and beyond. For example, we talk about the readiness economy, the remote economy, the logistics economy, and the automated economy. As just an example, the readiness economy, Thomas Friedman from the New York Times likes to point out that COVID-19 is not a black swan event, the kind of event that is once a lifetime and can't be predicted. It was actually, he likes to call it a black elephant event. It was the elephant in the room that nobody was paying attention to. Well, guess what? We're all paying attention now. So if you sort of use that as a starting point, okay, well, guess what? Well, industry and government alike are going to start to invest very extensively in, in readiness. And that's not just readiness for the next pandemic, God forbid, but it's also for physical infrastructure failures. It's for cyber attacks. It's for, environmental catastrophes, a host of other kind of failures. Well, if you believe that, and again, I don't think it's hard to you don't be much of a futurist, much of a prognosticator to be able to sort of see that that's likely to happen. Okay, yeah. Now what are the jobs and skills that are going to support that kind of transformation? So if you can take yourself on that kind of journey of the imagination, then actually seeing out into the future with some level of confidence isn't quite as hard as it sounds.
Yeah, and you raised a good point, Matt, which, and I know time is quickly running down on us in this conversation. We have a lot more we could say, but I want to get into a couple more questions. But a quick observation off that is the work you talked about of tagging the skills in courses and moving down to that granularity, I think can also help against this, because as you just said, there are clear trends and opportunities that are going to create jobs in the future that you can forecast based on current data and based on other events we know are going to come down the pipeline. We don't know the exact makeup of a job or function or role, perhaps 10 years from now, but we can actually have a pretty good idea of sets of skills that'll be at the heart of a lot of those jobs. And if you imbue your students and build those skills and knowledge in them, it'll create that flexibility, that dexterity where it is valuable, right? And they can move adjacent as needed. We got an audience question, which I think is spot on with this, which is, how do you see higher ed more formally connecting with business to determine those skill needs in advance? And are there specific verticals where that is happening more than in others?
So I think there's a couple of ways that higher education institutions need to up their game in terms of interacting with industry. One of those is not surprisingly the use of data. A lot of the we were joking before about the donut breakfast, and that's tended to be kind of how higher education institutions, once a year, twice a year, to get some handful of large employers around the table and listen to them. And usually when you do that, first of all, you're missing a whole big part of the market. Let's say you're a community college and you're starting an allied health program. Well, getting the couple big hospital companies in town at the table, that's not that hard, but you actually probably already know what they're going to say. But if most of your graduates are going to wind up in small clinical practice, those people are not around the table. So data allow you to listen to employers with greater granularity and at scale. That said, there is no substitute for actually having the conversations, but the key there is, again, getting to granularity and specificity. When you just put people together around donuts and coffee, you tend to hear a lot of, I don't care what they know, I'll train them on that. I just want them. Actually, when you look at what employers are then saying in terms of their requirements for talent, they articulate in their job posting, they're actually very specific. And so I think if you can go in and say, hey, look, these are the pain points we see in this experience. Let's talk about that. That actually tends to provide a basis for much more powerful interaction with employers. So I think that can be very helpful, and as I said before, it needs to be part of launching any program.
Yeah, and as we go to the last question and wrap up, a thought from me on that also is, data is the way to make sure you're asking the right questions and asking the right people the right questions, right? So in other words, most of your graduates are actually not, in fact, going to the major hospitals and in your cluster, if you will, but they're going to small clinics, one-off doctor practices, and the like. those are the people you need to have around the table to ask them the questions about where the shortfalls are, or observe their businesses, or pull data, frankly, on their businesses directly, so that you can understand more directly what is and isn't needed. And data, to me, is part of constructing these narratives and theories about what the world needs, and they're about filling in pictures, right? And as you start to put the right mosaic around, if you've clearly identified what success looks up at the front, made that a hard data metric, and then you can use data to say, hey, do we have the confidence that this program will allow us to hit these clear goals? Well, then you have significantly de-risked this process, and ideally you've built in a model that those initial metrics, hey, assume that 20% perhaps of your program launches will not work out, but that's a heck of a lot better than the 50% to 2/3 that you found at the outset. So last word from you, Matt. What advice would you leave people with who are digesting the findings from this report right now?
So I would, sort of speak to a couple of things here. I think first of all, I think the point that you make is spot on. That we really need to be very focused in terms of how we construct programs. We have to get beyond the haphazard approach, and we have to build in the kind of metrics that help us to evaluate decisions both at launch and beyond launch. And so just 4 key thoughts here. One, about starting with an understanding of what the opportunity space looks like for program graduates, particularly around master's programs, associate's programs, which are where most program starts are happening. And where universities are most likely, in community college, are most likely to look at as growth opportunities. That's where you need to start and understand what is going to be the market for those graduates. That's what's going to be the dynamo behind things. Also understanding what students are looking for, what are their expectations, setting the metrics, and then, as we've talked a lot about, knowing when to quit, when to stand pat. I want to just sort of bring 2 quick factors here, realizing that we're running short on time. One about why this is so important right now, and the other about what we can kind of the contours of why there may be also even greater challenges than we think. Maybe I'll start there and on a positive note. But I think, look, we've been talking thus far, and this report focuses on degree programs. But the reality is that most universities, they look to where the growth is. That growth is around, increasingly around professional programs, around non-degree certificate programs. And that's a part of the market where there's even greater dynamism, where absent good structures, good processes, good data, you're even more likely to get it wrong. And so, on the one side, and then the other side, because there's less crystal ball involved, right? You're starting short form programs. They're not accredited. You can get into the market faster. You can be more responsive, and you don't need to skate as far ahead, just to push that analogy a little bit further. And so that's a great opportunity, but it says that if we're going to approach those, we've got to do it with even more discipline. And the other reason why, and I think a very connected reason why, both these, what we found, the findings of this report are so frustrating, is that this is a time when there's so much opportunity for higher education. And I know that's kind of a counterintuitive thing to say, right? Whereas, as you pointed out at the start, there's been a 16% decline in first-year enrollments just this year. There's been a significant decline in enrollments demographically over the last decade, more expected, as you pointed out. And so this would be an odd time to think about growth. And yet, I would say that instead of thinking about a market for higher education in the U.S. that's 17 million students, I would say that by 2030, there's no reason why we can't have 30 million students. And that's a bold statement and takes a lot of work to get there. But I think the key then is actually thinking about how do we change the structures of what we do? How do we have programs that are better aligned to opportunity? How do we have programs that are perhaps more granular, more focused on skills, less focused on degrees? To reach that goal, to make this an opportunity now, as so many people's careers are changing and the like, it's when people need learning. And so for us to fulfill on the opportunity of this moment means we've got to do, again, a better job of getting new programs right, of making good bets and not bad bets.
It's
Michael,
very well said, Matt.
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining. And again, for anybody who'd like to go into the report in more detail, please feel free to reach out. And of course, feel free to download the report and share it widely. As mentioned before, we'll have a report coming out, I think, toward the end of next week on the jobs and careers and skills that will be driving the recovery and beyond. And please, I hope people will be on the lookout for it and use that as a guidepost to try to figure out what are the opportunity areas that may be most fruitful going forward. Michael, again, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in.